Hi, welcome to the Sports Think Tank Live. It's a great afternoon this afternoon, and where we're going to try and catch up with a great friend of ours, Damian Stevenson. I've known Damian at his time at Swim England and ASA before that for some time, and welcome him today in his role now as owner of DS Insight. And so we're going to be looking at insight-led sport and physical activity and what it means. And so welcome, Damian. Really good to have you here today.
Thanks, Andy. Great to be here.
Yeah. I suppose we've spoken a little bit before over the last sort of period, particularly during sort of COVID crisis. But I suppose I just wanted to say two things to kick off with. I mean, first of all, what is insight? And is it probably the most overused word in the sports and physical activity sector at the moment? Is it properly understood?
Yeah. Good question. A really good question. To be honest, now that I'm positioning myself as a research and insight consultant, I get asked this question quite a lot. And to be honest, as a few of my old colleagues at Swim England were very fortunate and kind to say, it's the golden thread that can run through an organisation. So for me, it's the evidence base that can inform your decision making at all levels of an organisation, whether that's research, whether that's data, and big data and data science is increasingly prominent in terms of how organisations are making decisions, measuring success, and being that engine room to support businesses really going forward and growing.
Yeah. And clearly, over the last few years in particular, we've used this phrase "insight-led." We've wanted most national governing bodies, and Sport England funding has been not an imposition. Quite rightly, it has. We're trying to be insight-led. So, where are we now as a sector in the sort of the quality of the work that we've got? I'm going to big you up a little bit, but I think one of the great strengths is you came from the commercial sector and into the sports sector, so you brought that expertise with you. I don't want to name names, but where in the journey are we compared to some of the best insight-led private sector and commercial parts of the sector?
I think being very candid about it, we've come a long way, and we've still got a distance to go. Having presented alongside at conferences with your big banks or retailers, FMCG retailers, wow, some of the scale of their insight operations, having been part of one when I was at Boots back in Nottingham, in my Nottingham days, significant investment goes into whether that's crunching advantage card data or looking at customer trends, and it'll be happening this year more than ever before because of the pandemic and so forth, and potentially changing attitudes. I think from a sport and physical activity sector, there's a lot more out there, which is good. I think the challenge is sometimes signposting it and actually it getting to the right people at the right time to inform the decisions that they need to take, whether it's a strategic level or whether it's about investments into programs and marketing campaigns, those sorts of things. But yeah, I think it's improved significantly. I would say that, wouldn't I? Having been on a 6-year journey through swimming up to earlier this year. And yeah, I think there's a way to go. I think the advent of a lot of online booking this year will help move hopefully more focus onto digital side of things and getting, I suppose, the importance of organizations getting their data strategies correct. Do they know everything they need to know about their members, their volunteers, their staff even, and certainly the wider audiences in terms of participation and engagement that they need to talk to and encourage into their sports and activities.
Yeah. And as you know, one of the key drivers of the think tank is to ensure there's that co-creation and collaboration across the sector as much as possible. So in terms of the quantum of data, is there a consistency in what we have? I mean, obviously, there's been some great, as you just say, the last 3-4 years in particular, there's been a development of the amount of data and the types of data we've got. And it probably feels like we're in a better place. But is that consistent, or what more can we do to ensure that we've got that?
Yeah, I think there has been a game change in terms of the, I wouldn't say this without due cause, in terms of the wider outcomes that were a key part of the government's and the Sport England strategies, and how that raised the profile of it not just being about physical health, as a benefit and corollary of getting people to be active and therefore healthier. I think that broader engagement in terms of community, in terms of personal efficacy, etc., has been huge. And there's a lot more evidence in terms of the value of sport and physical activity than ever before. I also think there are some really strong areas, sort of, whether that's active partnerships and locations that are focused on theory of change or whole systems approach to getting things right and improving engagement in local areas, or whether it's organizations like Street Games and Sported, who've really taken a lead to not only understand their target audiences that they want to engage with their programs, but also understand how the pandemic has changed attitudes and behaviors this year. And so I think we've moved over the last few years from being able to say what's happening in very clear metrics to starting to unpick a little bit more about the why things are happening and how we can start to improve things further in the future. But I think we've still got a little bit more to go out there.
Yeah. Actually, just pick up on that. There's an interesting point we were talking about before, is particularly, we've moved from active people survey to active live. So it's a little bit better in terms of the sort of the roundedness of what we're trying to collect. But, if we're generally moving into this place where we're measuring social outcomes or generally those 5 outcomes that were asked in the Sport England and the government strategy, sort of personal well-being, mental well-being, where are we in sort of collecting that data at scale to demonstrate that we're able to make a change? And I know a number of bodies have looked at this social return on investment, and you did your work at swimming. Where's that going? Are we still got some way to go?
I think so. I think what this year has proved is that we, in one respect, we can tell that story collectively as a sector more effectively than we've ever been able to before.
Yeah.
On another level, it's still not necessarily helping win all of the arguments. It's helping a few, and they've been very notable in terms of a huge effort that's been made across the sector into the lobbying, government at the highest levels, and so forth. I still think there's more that needs to happen, and I think maybe that's around the longer term insight and research that could be done with cohorts to, especially this year, understand what the long-term impacts and implications of the pandemic are, not just on their attitudes, motivations to be active and how that changes through the seasons, but also into next year, how that might shift their behaviors and how much risk, how much appetite for changing things people have. And I think there's a huge amount of insight that will be required going forward to unpick that in more detail.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We'll give you a little chance to have a sort of pick up a little bit on the sort of your project ideas for building this, but just particularly off the back of COVID, we have seen massive declines, and what they've done is they've reinforced the inequalities that we saw in levels of participation right across our sport and physical activity sector. It's actually reinforced many of those. In terms of the insight, how reactive can you be to sort of a model that, the sort of some of the insight we had before COVID, how much of it is relevant post-COVID? And, is a lot of that having to be rewritten in a sense to sort of match the, we've all got fed up with whatever terminology is, the new normal, the way to build back better, build back stronger, etc. But there is going to be a slightly different world post-COVID. And have we got to not tear everything up, but just look again at what we've learned?
I think the short answer is we don't really know. We don't understand it fully enough yet. We're still going through it, aren't we? We're still in a state of the nation where we're in different tiers. We're in very different situations economically. Our personal situations might have been affected by unemployment, might be affected by someone who volunteers in a food bank on a weekly basis. You see people who are really struggling with balancing and being able to feed their families, etc. And for me, I think there's a huge amount of insight that needs to unpick what sport and physical activity actually, even sort of detaching from what that terminology means, but what it could be to them and how motivated or otherwise they are, given there may be more pressing existential challenges in their lives. And I think one of the areas of insight I'm particularly interested in starting the conversation about is a more ethnographic approach of talking to people, understanding and walking a mile in their shoes and hearing their language in terms of how busy they are, how focused they are in terms of calories, nutrition, and whether it's supporting their families, their neighbours, their friends, etc. What does being active and movement really mean to them? And in the longer term, how can we evolve that so that we can, part of this year has been the lack of social interaction.
Yeah.
I think, however, the sector emerges from this year and into 2021, and as things become that new normal you referenced, social interaction, yes, virtually is fine, but eventually when things relax, understanding how we can really define the visible and increase the visibility of movement and activity through what makes us human, I think will be fundamental to the future success of it.
Yeah, it's a really important point. And we're talking a little bit before. I'll pick up on one or two bits of those points. As you said, it's just about how other people see sport and physical activity or movement, of whether it's even a consideration. I think we talked about a stats that you had in your days of boots, just about how often consumers actually even thought, you lived and breathed boots. Most of us don't really think about it more than once a quarter or once a year, if we're lucky, when we're rushing around pre-Christmas to get those Christmas gifts that we used to. It's the same in politics. They used to say that people think about politics for about 17 seconds a week. For those who's lived and breathed it, we realise it is pretty irrelevant to people. So I suppose, given that Sport England strategy is heading into how we need to engage those most disadvantaged and those who are probably least active, it's not on their radar, so is it? So where does the insight take us on that, Damian, in terms of how we engage those groups? And are we trying to engage them in something they're never going to be interested in? We've got to find completely new ways of doing that. And that goes into that wider piece around creating active lifestyles we talked about previously.
No, absolutely. I think you need to understand really what the latent demand is and what those moments of truth are for. There's been insight on this before from the DCMS's Taking Part survey, which did track people through big life events and understood that moments of truth, if you like, moving house or leaving secondary school, are significant moments in someone's lives where they may have pause for actually reevaluating. Just like, having a baby. And, one of the things that, going back to my boots days, and you referenced it, being involved in the bounty pack and getting your brand in there, and your brand values being part of looking after people and your family and being central to that new journey, that new world when you return home with the new arrival is fundamental. And for me, I think, hopefully sport and activity can be a little cuter about that and about some fairly, what could be quite simple innovations linked to new partnerships. So partnering with the Bounty Pack, partnering with Right Move, and understanding when people change houses or whatever, actually, is there a story to be told? And yes, we might well be preaching to the converted with that. They may already be people who are active, but I think that's where the insight can really help unpick who is most going to benefit and be most open to some of those new messages and new ways of being active.
Yeah. And that's crucial, isn't it? We were just talking again about insight should be used is that there's limited resources available for all of us in the sector. And so those resources have got to be really targeted at those who are going to benefit most. And as we know, they are probably those that we've just talked about, the group that we don't really talk to or understand well enough. So is there a new school of thought in terms of how we reach? We always ban the think tank, the hard to reach as a terminology, because they're not hard to reach. It's just that we don't try hard enough to understand them. So this is probably a crucial area for yourselves, isn't it? We're asked lots of times, how do we target our scarce resources to have most impact? And will insight and some of the work that you're doing enable us in active partnerships, in national governing bodies, in the sport for development sector, is really to make those really incisive calls on where our limited resources are used?
I think we've already talked about the latent demand. I think there's a co-creation piece here as well, which is understanding from certain cohorts, and certainly not lumping inactive people together, not even looking at it geographically, but looking at it at community level and understanding, what are their drivers on a social basis, what are their motivations in terms of their day-to-day lives, and how can we weave in a conversation about this and co-create. So getting people who are the decision makers across the sector in alongside people who can then check and challenge and come up with those ideas as to how best to engage them in something that isn't necessarily formal structured sport, and might just be about moving a little bit more, or doing a good turn and being good community citizens, or even engaging people with different types of after school club that isn't quite the Cubs Scouts aspect. And as an old Cub leader, I'm aware that often we got asked to do dodgeball on a weekly, or football on a weekly basis, and we always fought hard to give them a different flavour of so many different things each week. Why do we have to focus on one sport or activity and hope that someone sticks and changes their behaviour in line with who we might be which organization might be funding that particular program? I think looking at it, co-creating and doing it without any preconceptions would be challenging to us as a sector. And that's from someone who's been in the sector for six years now, and has been part of many of those conversations previously. But actually to do it without those preconceptions and say, well, what if this became a part of your life? And rather than, as you said, the boots or any shop being 0. whatever percent of someone's life, just like maybe voting and politics. Actually, how do you weave this in? How do you make it part of what defines you as a human being and gives you part of your identity going forwards? Because there's some big challenges. And yet if you get it right, with the value of swimming, with the value of sport and activity that Sport England have done, and a lot of other sports are now looking at that in detail. Again, the evidence base is there, not just in terms of the pound, shilling and pence, but the social return on investment. There are some very interesting numbers there. And I think that's where it goes back to the previous conversation then. It just strengthens the lobbying point and makes this even more important at a policy level for governments and local authorities to really engage with.
Yeah. You said a few times, Damian, when we've worked in the past, is that one of the dangers of doing insight is that you have to deliver some really unpalatable truths. Is that the point of gathering the insight is to speak into the echo chamber and challenge some of our own preconceptions. That's the whole point of diversity. It's about diversity of thought as well, isn't it? Not just including people's lived experiences, not just a number of those individuals. So, first of all, describe some of that. And has there been one of the most what's been the most difficult piece of insight you've had to deliver, knowing full well you've had to say, please don't shoot the messenger before you deliver it?
Well, that's the exact phrase that I used after this particular presentation. I'm not sure whether there'll be people from my old world at Trent University who might see this, but certainly when there was a presentation and I made the mistake in the presentation of referring to students as customers, and this was with the advent of tuition fees coming through several years ago now. Oh boy, it was in a room of academics and senior management, and I just thought, oh dear, I might have lost the audience, but actually it forced a reappraisal, and I guess that's it's a good point you make. Insight isn't always about just confirming your intuitions. If that was the case, then where would the new development come from? Often. And when insight is at its boldest and best, it will be challenging those preconceptions, and it will be causing that reappraisal, both from a senior strategic perspective, and also from that maybe I do need to change things to become more customer focused or consumer focused, and think about how to appeal to particular audiences within society.
And that's another classic, isn't it? So I sort of find myself wondering whether I should talk about them as customers or consumers or players or participants. But at the end of the day, for most of us, they are customers, consumers. They're making consuming choices, and therefore the terminology is important. It's also, even if we don't use that, we have to regard that. I was talking about that this morning to somebody about the customer journey into the Sports and Development Coalition. You know, for people joining, there is a journey, and it's a customer journey. They could go elsewhere, even if it's not their money they're spending, it's their time. So I think you're entirely right there. Is there anything in particular, Damian, sort of as we draw to a close, just to sort of in 2021 that you're looking forward to? I know you've got some ideas around some project work and how we can help working through the think tank and yourself to co-create and collaborate a little bit more in this, because it goes back to the first question, is that there's probably a quantum of data and insight officers and expertise now across the sector. And I suppose, you know, does it work well working together, or is there more we can do to help you?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. I guess the big gap, and it's an obvious one, given everything that we've gone through this year, is, you know, what is the long-term impact of coronavirus and the pandemic on what might have been established behaviours and consolidated attitudes beforehand. We're still living through it. We're still in a tier system in the run-up to Christmas, and we're not quite sure how long that will last. So for me, a big part of the knowledge that the sector needs, and it goes across any sector, any industry that you're operating in, is what are the long-term implications for my business? And, you know, are there quick wins in terms of understanding how I may be able to position, you know, what we are developing in the short term? Because I think, you know, I know a lot of people have been very busy this year. It also allows that opportunity to sort of pause, maybe as we become slightly, reflective at the end of the year, to say, well, actually, do we know everything we need to know to best inform our strategies and our plans into next year, or do we need more insight? And part of my idea is to just stimulate the debate. Just as you've been doing with the terminology of sport and physical activity. For me, it's about, well, do we know everything that we need to know to take the sector forward? And I think, you know, it's a really exciting time. Having seen some of the emerging themes from the conversations and the consultation with Sport England and that process, I think it's really important that we look at this and say, you know, we know what's happening, and we know that in good detail. Do we know it quickly enough? Are we often caught a little bit behind the curve in terms of understanding trends? And I think, not a criticism of any particular sector, I just think it's been one of those years where a lot of people have been caught. We have as a society, in terms of what happened and what the impact's been. But I think as we go in, you know, as we're now in the colder months, especially, understanding how attitudes and behaviours have been affected towards activity, and what might need to be true to support people to build those behaviours back up, whatever the new normal looks like, or what have you, I think is going to be absolutely fascinating. And also, I suppose the final point is encouraging collaboration wherever possible. And it comes back to the point I was making earlier, is a lot of people might not be interested in one sport or one activity, and being able to provide a mixture of them, a blend that people can just break down those barriers and make it, you know, much less about the elite and the talent pathways, which are obviously fundamental, and goodness knows we need those and those role models. But this is much more around, you know, actually, how do we strip it down to the simplest possible way of getting involved in any shape or form of an activity? And I think developing insight projects around, with that at the heart of it, will be a very interesting area of development for next year.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, if we can think about how we make things fun, which is fundamentally what for most people this is about, or it isn't, you know, they're not there for our behest to get in. Plenty of people want to get involved in the elite pathways, but for the vast majority, the numbers of people we need to be getting moving or active, much of that is going to be around just having fun. So that's a great message. Damian, is there anything else that sort of springs to mind in the sort of the excitement of 2021? I think you're right, is that there's going to be no quick return. I'm talking earlier today to some other people in this sector, thinking probably third quarter of 2021 before you start to see some return to some kind of normality with a number of sports, particularly those that are both most severely affected so far. So it's going to be, I think there's a patience would be a watchword for the next period. And hopefully, as you say, by collaborating and cooperating, we can help across the sector with the insight so that we all look after each other. I've been saying that quite a bit to people, is that if we all look after each other during this period, we'll all come out of it a lot stronger. This is not a race to the bottom. This is a race to collaborate and cooperate more than ever, perhaps, is it?
Definitely. No, I fully agree with you. I think there's a huge opportunity just to, review the plans. Everyone's putting a lot of effort into developing their plans for next year. Of course they are. I think being honest around, what your objectives are, what realistically is going to be possible next year. And then thinking about, well, actually, if we're looking at this for a year, 18 months until things are back to what we could consider a level of normality, what does that mean we need to do in the meantime? And that might be around data architecture, it might be around digital strategy, and it might be around the research and insight programs that can help inform that decision making that we talked about earlier. But I think there's some very exciting opportunities in terms of how we can talk to different parts of the the population and really put them at the heart of decision making going forward. So fingers crossed, watch this space.
Oh, that's brilliant, David. And as always, I've appreciated your positive attitude. Your sort of let's work from where we are. Let's make it work. There's plenty of us who we want to work collaboratively together. So I'm sure we'll be doing that. So a big thank you, David, from DS Insight, as it is now. I find that difficult to get used to, but I'd like to thank you for spending some time with us. So that's a great way to end 2020. Plenty of opportunities for more of this work in 2021, and we all look forward to creating that opportunity that Damian has spoken about. And if you're interested in what Damian said, then please get in touch with myself or Damian direct, who will be able to share some of his expertise with you. So thanks ever so much again for everybody for being with us, and we'll see you next time.